And then there were none, chapter 2. Remember that you might be reading a newer version of the story than I have. This is what the cover of mine looks like. So yours might look a little bit different. Some of the words might be different, but you'll get the gist of it regardless of whether or not you're reading my version or not. Here we go. Outside Oakbridge Station, a little group of people stood in momentary uncertainty. Behind them stood porters with suitcases. One of them called, "Jim." The driver of one of the taxis stepped forward. "You in for Indian Island, maybe?" he asked in a soft Devon voice. 4 voices gave assent, and then immediately afterwards gave quick, surreptitious glances at each other. The driver said, addressing his remarks to Mr. Justice Wargrave as the senior member of the party, "There are 2 taxis here, sir. One of them must wait till the slow train from Exeter gets in. A matter of 5 minutes? There's one gentleman coming by that. Perhaps one of you wouldn't mind waiting? You'd be more comfortable that way." Vera Claythorne, her own secretarial position clear in her mind, spoke at once. "I'll wait," she said, "if you'll go on." She looked at the other 3. Her glance and voice had that slight suggestion of command in it that comes from having occupied a position of authority, because remember, Vera Claythorne is the character who used to be a PE teacher. She might have been directing which tennis sets the girls were to play in. Miss Brent said stiffly, "Thank you," bent her head forward, centered one of the taxis, the door of which the driver was holding open. Mr. Justice Wargrave followed her. Captain Lombard said, "I'll wait with Miss Claythorne," said Vera. "My name is Lombard. Philip Lombard." The porters were piling luggage on the taxi. Inside, Mr. Justice Wargrave said with due legal caution, "Beautiful weather we are having." Miss Brent said, "Yes, indeed." A very distinguished old gentleman, she thought to herself, quite unlike the usual type of man in seaside guest houses. Evidently, Miss Oliver had good connections. Mr. Justice Wargrave inquired, "Do you know this part of the world well?" "I've been to Cornwall and to Torquay, but this is my first visit to this part of Devon." The judge said, "I also am unacquainted with this part of the world." The taxi drove off. The driver of the second taxi said, "Like to sit inside while you're waiting?" Vera said decisively, "Not at all." Captain Lombard smiled. He said, "That sunny wall looks more attractive, unless you'd rather go inside the station." "No, indeed. It's so delightful to get out of that stuffy train." He answered, "Yeah, traveling by train is rather trying in this weather," Vera said conventionally. "I do hope it lasts. The weather, I mean. Our English summers are so treacherous." With a slight lack of originality, Lombard added, "Do you know this part of the world well?" "No, I've never been here before," she added quickly, conscientiously determined to make her position clear at once. "I haven't even seen my employer yet." "Your employer?" "Yes, I'm Mrs. Owen's secretary." "Oh, I see." Just imperceptibly, his manner changed. It was slightly more assured, easier in tone. He said, "Isn't that rather unusual?" Vera laughed. "Oh, no, I don't think so." Her own secretary was suddenly taken ill, and she wired to an agency for a substitute, and they sent me. So that was it. "And suppose you don't like the job when you get there?" Vera laughed again. "Oh, it's only temporary. A holiday job. I've got a permanent job at a girls' school. As a matter of fact, I'm frightfully thrilled at the prospect of seeing Indian Island. There's so much about it in the papers. Is it really very fascinating? Now remember, you might have the version that calls it Soldier Island, but it's the same place." Lombard said, "I don't know. I haven't seen it." "Oh, really? The Owens are frightfully keen on it, I suppose. What are they like? Do tell me." Lombard thought, awkward this. "Am I supposed to have met them or not?" he said quickly. "There's a wasp crawling up your arm." "No. Keep quite still." He made a convincing pounce. "There, it's gone." So Lombard did that to distract Vera because she was starting to talk about the Owens. And remember, Lombard was hired to go there for 100 guineas by a man named Isaac Morris. Lombard doesn't really know what he's doing there. He doesn't know what his job is there. He doesn't know anything about the host. He doesn't know anything about the Owens. And so he doesn't want to let on to Vera that he has no idea who the Owens are. So he pretends there's a wasp on her arm so that he can change the subject. "Oh, thank you. There are a lot of wasps about this summer." "Yeah, I suppose it's the heat. Who are we waiting for, do you know?" "I haven't the least idea." The loud, drawn-out scream of an approaching train was heard. Lombard said, "That'll be the train now." It was a tall, soldierly old man who appeared at the exit from the platform. So if you remember, the tall, soldierly man would be MacArthur. His gray hair was clipped close, and he had a neatly trimmed white mustache. His porter, staggering slightly under the weight of the solid leather suitcase, indicated Vera and Lombard. Vera came forward in a confident manner. She said, "I'm Mrs. Owen's secretary. This is a car here waiting." She added, "This is Mr. Lombard." The faded blue eyes, shrewd in spite of their age, sized up Lombard. For a moment, a judgment showed in them. Had there been anyone to read it? So this is kind of an interesting point of what MacArthur's first impression of Lombard is. Good-looking fellow. Something just a little wrong about him, like he just doesn't trust him. The three of them got into the waiting taxi. They drove through the sleepy streets of Little Oakbridge and continued about a mile on the train on the main Plymouth Road. Then they plunged into a maze of cross-country lanes, steep, green, and narrow. General MacArthur said, "I don't know this part of Devon at all. My little place is in East Devon, just on the borderline of Dorset." Vera said, "It really is lovely here. The hills and the red earth and everything so green and luscious looking." Philip Lombard said critically, "It's a bit shut in. I like open country myself, where you can see what's coming." General MacArthur said to him, "You've seen a bit of the world, I fancy." Lombard shrugged his shoulders despairingly. "I've knocked about here and there, sir." He thought to himself, "He'll ask me now if I was old enough to be in the war. These old boys always do." But General MacArthur did not mention the war. And that would be an example of foreshadowing, because General MacArthur doesn't want to bring up the war, and you'll find out why later. They came up over a steep hill and down a zigzag track to Sticklehaven, a mere cluster of cottages with a fishing boat or two drawn up on the beach. Illuminated by the setting sun, they had their first glimpse of Indian Island jutting up out of the sea to the south. Vera said, surprised, "It's a long way out." So it's kind of interesting, because this is a place that they've all heard about in their lives. Like maybe you've heard about a vacation place, maybe Hearst Castle, and you have a vision in your mind of what that looks like, or the Winchester Mystery Mansion, or the Channel Islands. And then when you see it, you think, this isn't exactly what I pictured in my mind. So it's interesting here to see what Vera's first impression is. She had pictured it differently, close to shore, crowned with a beautiful white house, but there was no house visible, only the boldly silhouetted rock with its faint resemblance to a giant Indian's head. So that's how it got its name. In your book, of course, it would be Soldier Island. There was something sinister about it, something scary, something not right. She shivered faintly. Outside a little inn, the Seven Stars, 3 people were sitting there. There was the hunched elderly figure of the judge, the upright form of Miss Brent, and a third man, a big, bluff man, who came forward and introduced himself. "Thought we might as well wait for you," he said. "Make one trip of it. Allow me to introduce myself. Name's Davis. Natal South Africa is my natal spot." Haha. So that's kind of a dad joke, because there's a city in South Africa named Natal. And Natal also might be like the place you were born or where you're from. And so he makes this dad joke that Natal, South Africa is where he's from. Now remember that this is actually Bloor, but he wants to pretend to be Davis. We don't know exactly what's going on or why, but this is actually Bloor. He laughed breezily. Mr. Justice Wargrave looked at him with active malevolence, like hatred. He seemed to be wishing that he could order the court to be cleared. Miss Emily Brent was clearly not sure if she liked colonials. "Anyone care for a little nip before we embark?" asked Mr. Davis hospitably, which is William Henry Bloor. Nobody assenting to this position, Mr. Davis turned and held up a finger. "Mustn't delay, then. Our good host and hostess will be expecting us," he said. He might have noticed that a curious constraint came over the other members of the party. It was as though the mention of their host and hostess had a curiously paralyzing effect upon the guests. And that's because none of them actually know who the host and hostess are. So it makes them a little bit uncomfortable to think, am I supposed to know this person? What am I supposed to know about them? Do I let on to the others that I don't know the host? And so the mention of the host gives them this paralyzing effect, because now they realize, what's going on here? In response to Davis's beckoning finger, a man detached himself from a nearby wall against which he was leaning and came up to them. His rolling gait, the way that he walked, proclaimed him a man of the sea. He had a weather-beaten face and dark eyes with a slightly evasive expression. He spoke in his soft Devon voice. "Will you be ready to be starting for the island, ladies and gentlemen? The boat's waiting. There's 2 gentlemen coming by car. But Mr. Owen's orders was not to wait for them, as they might arrive at any time. The party got up. Their guide led them along a small stone jetty. Alongside it, a motorboat was lying. So this is the guy who drives the motorboat. His name is Fred Narracott. We don't see him very often in the story. His only real role is to bring the boat back and forth to the island. That's his job. It's a very small boat. Emily Brent said, "That's a very small boat." The boat's owner said persuasively, "She's a fine boat, that man. You could go to Plymouth in her just as easy as winking." Mr. Justice Wargrave said sharply, "There are a good many of us." "She'd take double the number, sir." Philip Lombard said in his pleasant, easy voice, "It's quite all right. Glorious weather, no swell." Rather doubtfully, Miss Brent permitted herself to be helped into the boat. The others followed suit. There was as yet no fraternizing among the party, like they weren't becoming friends. It was as though each member of it was puzzled by the other members. They were just about to cast loose when their guide paused, boat hook in hand. Down the steep track into the village, a car was coming, a car so fantastically powerful, so superlatively beautiful, that it had all the nature of an apparition. And so an apparition could mean like a ghost, but clearly that is not what it means in this context, because the car does not look like a ghost. It's used in this context, the word apparition, to mean something that inspires awe, that catches your breath. At the wheel sat a young man, his hair blown back by the wind. In the blaze of the evening light, he looked, not a man, but a young god, a hero god out of some northern saga. He touched the horn, and a great roar of sound echoed from the rocks of the bay. It was a fantastic moment. In it, Anthony Marston seemed to be something more than a mortal. Afterwards, more than one of those present remembered that moment. Fred Narracott, remember the guy who drives the boat, sat by the engine thinking to himself that this was a strange group of people. Not at all his idea of what Mr. Owen's guests were likely to be. He'd expected something altogether more classy, togged-up women and gentlemen in a yachting costume and all very rich and important-looking. This wasn't at all like Mr. Elmer Robson's parties. He was the guy that actually did used to own the island before now it's become a mystery who owns it. And Fred Narracott always took guests out to the island, no matter who the owner was. A faint grin came to Fred Narracott's lips as he remembered the millionaire's guests. That had been a party, if you like, and the drink they got through. This Mr. Owen must be a very different sort of gentleman. Funny it was, thought Fred, that he'd never yet set eyes on Owen, or his missus either. Never been down here yet, he hadn't. Everything ordered and paid for by that Mr. Morris. Instructions always very clear and payment prompt. Mr. Morris, remember, was the person who hired Lombard. He's a very minor character. We don't know very much about him. But he's the one that paid Lombard, and he's the one that's made all the arrangements for this island. But it was odd all the same. The papers said there was some mystery about Owen. Mr. Narracott agreed with them. Perhaps, after all, it was Miss Gabrielle Turrell who had bought the island. But that theory departed from him when he surveyed his passengers. Not this group of people. None of them looked like they would have anything to do with a film star. He summed them up dispassionately. One old maid, that be Emily Brent, the sour kind. He knew them well enough. She was a Tartar, he could bet. Old military gentleman, real army by the look of him, General MacArthur. Nice-looking young lady, Vera Claythorne, but the ordinary kind, not glamorous, no Hollywood touch about her. That bluff, cheery gent. He wasn't a real gentleman, meaning I think he's lying about something. Retired salesman, that's what he is, thought Fred Narracott. The other gentleman, the lean, hungry-looking gentleman with the quick eyes. He was a strange one, he was. Just possible he might have something to do with the pictures. No, there was only one satisfactory passenger in the boat. The last gentleman. The one who had arrived in the car. And what a car! A car such as he had never been seen in Sticklehaven before. Must have cost hundreds and hundreds, a car like that. He was the right kind, born to money, he was. If the party had all been like him, he'd understand it. Strange business when you came to think of it. The whole thing was strange. Very strange. The boat churned in its way around the rock. Now at last the house came into view. The south side of the island was quite different. It shelved gently down to the sea. The house was there facing south, low and square and modern looking, with rounded windows letting in all the light. Now because the story was written about 100 years ago, it's easy to imagine, an old creepy looking house because of the stories era because we know that it's such an old tale. But for that era, it was actually a beautiful home. Very nice, had every amenity you would want. An exciting house, a house that lived up to expectation. Fred Narracott shut off the engine. They nosed their way gently into a little natural inlet between rocks. Philip Lombard said sharply, "Must be difficult to land here in dirty weather." Fred Narracott said cheerfully, "You can't land on Indian Island when there's a southeasterly. Sometimes 'tis cut off for a week or more." Vera Claythorne thought, "Catering must be very difficult. That's the worst of an island. All the domestic problems are so worrying, like how would you get all that food out there if there's a storm?" The boat grated against the rocks. Fred Narracott jumped out, and he and Lombard helped the others to alight. Remember, alight means to step down from something. Narracott made the boat fast to a ring in the rock. Then he led the way up steps cut in the rock. General McCarthy said, "Ha, delightful spot." But he felt uneasy. Darn odd sort of place. As the party ascended the steps and came out onto the terrace above, terrace just means like a porch, like an outdoor patio area, their spirits revived. In the open doorway of the house, a correct butler was waiting for them, and something about his gravity reassured them. And then the house itself was really most attractive, the view from the terrace magnificent. The butler came forward, bowing slightly. He was a tall, lank man, gray-haired, and very respectable. He said, "Will you come this way, please?" In the wide hall, drinks stood ready, rows of bottles. Anthony Marston, he's the young guy with the fancy car, spirits cheered up a little. He'd just been thinking that this was a rum kind of show. None of his lot, like he didn't like these people. What could his old friend Badger have been thinking about to let him in for this? However, the drinks were all right, plenty of ice too. What was it the butler chap was saying? Mr. Owen, unfortunately delayed, unable to get here till tomorrow. Instructions, everything they wanted. If they would like to go to their rooms, dinner would be ready at 8 o'clock. Vera had followed Mrs. Rogers upstairs, so we have the butler, Mr. Rogers, and now we're meeting his wife, who is like the equivalent of a maid, Mrs. Rogers. The woman had thrown open a door at the end of a passage, and Vera had walked into a delightful bedroom with a big window that opened wide upon the sea and another looking east. She uttered a quick exclamation of pleasure. Mrs. Rogers was saying, "I hope you've got everything you want, miss." Vera looked around. Her luggage had been brought up and had been unpacked. At one side of the room, a door stood open into a pale blue tiled bathroom. She said, quickly, "Yes, everything, I think. You'll ring the bell if you want anything, miss." Mrs. Rogers had a flat, monotonous voice. Vera looked at her curiously. Okay, so I really want you to picture this character, Mrs. Rogers. What do you think she looks like in her head, in your head, based on this description? What a white, bloodless ghost of a woman. Very respectable looking, with her hair dragged back from her face in her black dress. Strange, light eyes that shifted the whole time from place to place. Vera thought, she looks frightened of her own shadow. Yeah, that was it. Frightened. She looked like a woman who walked in mortal fear. A little shiver passed down Vera's back. What on earth was the woman afraid of? She said pleasantly, "I'm Mrs. Owen's new secretary. I expect you know that?" Mrs. Rogers said, "No, miss. I don't know anything. Just a list of ladies and gentlemen and what rooms they were to have." Vera said, "Mrs. Owens didn't mention me?" Mrs. Rogers' eyelashes flickered. "I haven't seen Mrs. Owen. Not yet. We only came here 2 days ago." Extraordinary people, these Owens, thought Vera. Aloud she said, "What staff is there here?" "Just me and Rogers, sir, miss." Vera frowned. 8 people in the house, 10 with the host and hostess, and only 1 married couple to do for them. Mrs. Rogers said, "I'm a good cook, and Rogers is handy about the house. I didn't know, of course, that there was to be such a large party." Vera said, "What you can manage." "Oh, yes, miss, I can manage. If there's to be large parties often, perhaps Mr. Owen could get extra help in." Vera said, "I expect so." Mrs. Rogers turned to go. Her feet moved noiselessly over the ground. She drifted from the room like a shadow. Vera went over to the window and sat down on the window seat. She was faintly disturbed. Everything, somehow, was a little strange. The absence of the Owens, the pale, ghost-like Mrs. Rogers, and the guests. Yes, the guests were strange, too. An oddly assorted party. Vera thought, I wish I'd seen the Owens. I wish I knew what they were like. She got up and walked restlessly about the room. A perfect bedroom decorated throughout in the modern style. Off-white rugs on the gleaming parquet floor, faintly tinted walls, a long mirror surrounded by lights, a mantelpiece bare of ornaments save for an enormous block of white marble shaped like a bear, a piece of modern sculpture in which was inset a clock. Over it, in a gleaming chromium frame, was a big square of parchment. That's just a fancy word for paper. A poem. She stood in front of the fireplace and read it. It was the old nursery rhyme that she remembered from her childhood days. 10 little Indian boys went out to dine. One choked his little self, and then there were 9. 9 little Indian boys sat up very late. One overslept himself, and then there were 8. 8 little Indian boys traveling in Devon. One said he'd stay there, and then there were 7. 7 little Indian boys chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in halves, and then there were 6. 6 little Indian boys playing with a hive. A bumblebee stung one, and then there were 5. 5 little Indian boys going in for law. One got in chancery, and then there were 4, so think of that like death row. 4 little Indian boys going out to sea. A red herring swallowed one, and then there were 3. 3 little Indian boys walking in the zoo. A big bear hugged one, and then there were 2. 2 little Indian boys sitting in the sun. One got frizzled up, and then there was 1. 1 little Indian boy left all alone. He went and hanged himself, and then there were none. Vera smiled. Of course, this was Indian Island. She went and sat again by the window, looking out to sea. How big the sea was. From here, there was no land to be seen anywhere, just a vast expanse of blue water rippling in the evening sun. The sea, so peaceful today, sometimes so cruel. The sea that dragged you down to its depths. Drowned. Found drowned. Drowned at sea. Drowned. Drowned. No, she wouldn't remember. She would not think of it. All of that was over. Remember, Vera was the character who was the subject of a coroner's inquest, where the coroner who investigates how a person died looked at a situation, Vera was questioned, found that she didn't have anything to be blamed for. She was not at fault. But regardless, we're starting to see a little bit more of a picture of what happened there with Vera's coroner's inquest. Dr. Armstrong came to Indian Island just as the sun was sinking into the sea. On the way across, he had chatted to the boatman, a local man. He was anxious to find out a little about these people who owned Indian Island, but the man, Narracott, seemed curiously ill-informed, or perhaps unwilling to talk, so there's the boat driver again, Fred Narracott. So Dr. Armstrong chatted instead of the weather and of fishing. He was tired after his long motor drive. His eyeballs ached. Driving west, you were driving against the sun. Yes, he was very tired. The sea and perfect peace, that was what he needed. He would like, really, to take a long holiday, but he couldn't afford to do that. He could afford it financially, of course, but he couldn't afford to drop out. You were soon forgotten nowadays. No, now that he had arrived, he must keep his nose to the grindstone. He thought, all the same, this evening, I'll imagine to myself that I'm not going back. That I'm done with London and Harley Street, his business that he has in that fancy area, and all the rest of it. There was something magical about an island. The mere word suggested fantasy. He lost touch with the world. An island was a world of its own, a world perhaps from which he might never return. He thought, I'm leaving my ordinary life behind me. And smiling to himself, he began to make plans, fantastic plans for the future. He was still smiling when he walked up the rock-cut steps. In a chair on the terrace, an old gentleman was sitting, and the sight of him was vaguely familiar to Dr. Armstrong. Where had he seen that frog-like face, that tortoise-like neck, that hunched-up attitude? Yes, and those pale, shrewd little eyes. Of course, old Justice Wargrave. Notice throughout the book, the author constantly compares Justice Wargrave to a reptile. So you can imagine this little old man looking like a lizard or a tortoise. He had been given evidence once beforehand, meaning Dr. Armstrong had testified in Justice Wargrave's courtroom. Always looked half asleep, but was shrewd as could be when it came to a point of law, meaning he knew what he was doing, he knew his stuff. Had great power with the jury. It was said he could make their minds up for them any day of the week. He got 1 or 2 unlikely convictions out of them, A hanging judge, some people said. Funny place to meet him, here, out of the world. Mr. Justice Wargrave thought to himself, Armstrong. Remember him in the witness box. Very correct and cautious. All doctors are darn fools. Harley Street ones are the worst of the lot. And his mind dwelt malevolently on a recent conversation he had had with a suave personage in that very street. Aloud he grunted. Drinks are in the hall, Dr. Armstrong said. I must go and pay my respects to my host and hostess. Mr. Justice Wargrave closed his eyes, looking decidedly reptilian, and said, You can't do that. Dr. Armstrong was startled. Why not? The judge said, No host and hostess. Very curious state of affairs. I don't understand this place. Dr. Armstrong stared at him for a minute. When he thought the old gentleman had actually gone to sleep, Wargrave said suddenly, Do you know Constance Comington? No, I'm afraid I don't. It's of no consequence, said the judge. Very vague woman and practically unreadable handwriting. I was just wondering if I'd come to the wrong house. Dr. Armstrong shook his head and went up to the house. Mr. Justice Wargrave reflected on the subject of Constance Comington. Undependable, like all women. His mind went on to the two women in the house, the tight-lipped old maid, meaning Emily Brent, and the girl, meaning Vera Claythorne. He didn't care for the girl, cold-blooded young lady. No, 3 women, if you counted the Rogers woman, the maid. Odd creature, she looked scared to death. Respectable pair, and knew their job. Rogers, Mr. Rogers, coming out onto the terrace, he's the butler. That minute, the judge asked him, Is Lady Constance Comington expected, do you know? Mr. Rogers stared at him. No, sir, not to my knowledge. The judge's eyebrows rose, but he only grunted. He thought, Indian Island, eh? There's something not right. Now, in my copy of the book, there's something very offensive that we would never say today. In your copy, hopefully that's been omitted now. But I just wanted to address that obviously that would be something we would never say today. And we're going to move on. And I will tell you it happens one more time in the book. And each time I'll just substitute what should have been said, which is something seemed amiss. Anthony Marston was in his bath. He's the young guy who drives the fancy car. He luxuriated in his steaming water. His limbs had felt cramped after his long drive. Very few thoughts passed through his head. Anthony Marston was a creature of sensation and of action. He thought to himself, Must go through with it, I suppose. And thereafter dismissed everything from his mind. Warm, steaming water, tired limbs, presently a shave, a cocktail, dinner, and after? Mr. Bloor, who's introduced himself as Mr. Davis, pretending to be from South Africa, was tying his tie. He wasn't very good at this sort of thing. Did he look all right? He supposed so. Nobody had been exactly cordial or polite to him. Funny the way they all eyed each other, as though they knew. Well, it was up to him. He didn't mean to bungle his job. He glanced up at the framed nursery rhyme over his mantelpiece. Neat touch having that there. He thought, I remember this island when I was a kid. Never thought I'd be doing this sort of job in a house here. Good thing, perhaps, that one can't foresee the future. So he's got the same nursery rhyme in his room that Vera Claythorne had in hers about the 10 little Indians. And in your book, it's probably the 10 little soldiers. General MacArthur was frowning to himself. Darn it all, the whole thing was deuced odd. Not at all what he'd been led to expect. For 2 pins, he'd make an excuse and get away. Throw up the whole business. But the motorboat had gone back to the mainland. He'd have to stay. That fellow Lombard now, he was a strange man. Very strange. As the gong sounded, Philip Lombard came out of his room and walked to the head of the stairs. He moved like a panther, smoothly, noiselessly, and Philip Lombard is constantly compared to a panther throughout the book. So we have Justice Wargrave being compared to a reptile, and we have Philip Lombard being compared to a panther. He was smiling to himself. A week, eh? Who's going to enjoy that week? Oops, I skipped a part. He moved like a panther, smoothly and noiselessly. There was something of the panther about him altogether. A beast of prey, pleasant to the eye. He was smiling to himself. A week, eh? He was going to enjoy that week. In her bedroom, Emily Brent, the older judgy lady, dressed in black silk, ready for dinner, was reading her Bible. Her lips moved as she followed the words. The heathen that sunk down in the pit that they made, in the net which they hid is their own foot taken. The Lord is known by the judgment which he executes. The wicked is snared in the work of his own hands. The wicked shall be turned into hell. Her tight lips closed, she shut the Bible. Rising, she pinned a cairngorm brooch at her neck and went down to dinner. And that's the end of chapter 2.